A horse is your friend. It gives you freedom, fulfillment, takes care of your health and condition. It brings you joy and peace. A horse allows you to achieve your most desired goals in sports and in life. It helps you forget your worries, pursue your passions, and boost your self-confidence. What will you give in return for its friendship and devotion? Take care of its health. The Pet's Diag hair test will allow you to assess the condition of your horse. Skin and hair, muscles, joints, and hooves, immunity, growth and breeding activity. Check their condition and take measures based on our recommendations. Order a test on petsdiag.com and send us a mane hair sample. Remember, your horse counts on you. Pets Diag.
Hello to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope you hear me quite okay. Please confirm on the chat. Okay, sounds great. Thank you very much, Eva. Okay, so one more time, thank you very much. I'm Marcin Maciąg, CEO and co-owner in Pets Diag Laboratory. Laboratory where we specialize in elemental hair analysis for animals, for horses, of course, but also for dogs and cats. So I think that today's webinar is really needful for all of, horse owners, and not only, to explain how important are minerals in our well-being of our horses, in their health. And I'm really happy that our today's host is a really great expert, not only about hair testing for animals, but also hair testing for people, for human. And our host today is Lisa Pitel-Killah, Vykon Equine founder, hair mineral analysis expert and educator, board certified holistic health practitioner, functional diagnostic practitioner, and multi-time Kettlebell sport world champion. Her animal study includes holistic carnivore and equine nutritionist and advanced animal hair tissue mineral analysis. Lisa, it's a great honor to have you here. Please join us and please.
Thank you,
Hello.
Thank you, Marcia, for that wonderful introduction, and I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, it's the pleasure is for me and for our whole team. And please start our webinar.
Absolutely. So today we're going to talk all about the benefit of mineral balance in horses. So, I mean, obviously, if you're here, you either have a passion for a horse or horses, or maybe you even have a little background in mineral balance as well. So I'm going to share as much as I can today. And I'm going to also share an amazing case study that we did in one of our trials with the result after a 90-day protocol with one of our horses. So let's get started. So just a presentation disclaimer, obviously everything that I'm going to talk about is for educational purposes. The material isn't meant to diagnose any disease or condition, and any protocols that are mentioned as well are for educational purposes. If you'd like to put something together for your horse or horses, then you want to contact your horse's health practitioner or a veterinarian that knows mineral analysis. As well, please don't attempt to analyze HTMA without the support of a qualified health practitioner, mineral analysis practitioner, or your veterinarian. So hair tissue mineral analysis, what does it tell us? First of all, HTMA is a fabulous non-invasive diagnostic test that measures the mineral content in hair. Hair, nails, teeth, and bones are tissues in which trace minerals are available at a cellular level, so a deeper level than blood work. The levels of minerals measured in hair are closely correlated with the levels in the body's tissues and organs, and that's why it's so effective. HTMA has gained widespread acceptance among health professionals and is scientifically well established. It's been around since the early 1900s, became a little bit more well known in the 1970s, and in the 80s, that's when some of the big breakthroughs really came about with the HTMA and mineral balance. So let's talk about the basics of hair analysis. So hair in the growth phase is exposed to the internal metabolic environment in the body, and that goes for humans and of course our animals. So that metabolic environment includes circulating blood, lymph, and extracellular fluids. And so that's why when we're looking at hair and the analysis of that, we're picking up items and intricacies at a deeper level than what blood may show us. As it hardens, it retains metabolic products presented to it and becomes the perfect sample for testing bodily functions, metabolic trends, and of course, toxic metals. It's a wonderful snapshot of what's been happening in the body for a previous 3 to 4 months. And that's basically an approximation if your sample size is about 1.5 inches long. This allows us the measurement capabilities for changing up nutritional alterations and also making customized recommendations for vitamins and minerals. I mean, how many times are we guessing, not only for ourselves, but for our animals, based on the latest data of what the trends are with regards to the vitamins, minerals, and potentially amino acids that we might need. So why not use a blueprint that's actually going to identify what we as individuals need, because we're all different and our animals are all different as well. So taking a sample, first of all, you want to ensure that the horse has been washed and dried, right? We don't want a wet hair sample. And then you're ready to take the sample. If we don't have time for a bath or what have you, then at minimum, just comb through the main area at the bottom. You can see in the picture, I've identified the ideal area to take the hair sample. And then you can also clean the hair with alcohol for that particular spot, just to make sure that there's no contamination for the sample being tested. A sample should be taken from the bottom of the mane, cut as close to the skin as possible. Remember, as close to the skin is going to give us the recent data. And so again, we don't want it to be more than 1.5 inches long. So somewhere between 1 to 1.5 inches, and that's going to give us data from the last 3 to 4 months. It's critical that the sample be put in a regular paper envelope, not wrapped in foil, saran, or placed in a baggie of any kind, because those may contaminate the sample as well. So a plain paper envelope sealed is perfect. So Equine HTMA, it provides detailed information about a horse's health. Low mineral levels may be due to not only inadequate intake, right, from their food, but also potentially malabsorption of nutrients, right, if we have some GI issues with our horse or other imbalances. High mineral levels, on the other hand, may be due to overconsumption, storage of minerals, which the body may be doing in suffice of something else, and other imbalances as well. Remember that HTMA is an identifier for elevated toxic metals in the body, and hair is actually one of the best indicators for these elements. So we're going to touch on the #1 toxic metal found in horses a little bit later. HTMA brings to light issues months to years sometimes before blood serum testing will. And why? Because blood always wants to be in homeostasis. So if something in blood is low or elevated, if it's low, it's going to pull from our mineral reserves, which now is pulling from our reserves that should be stored for future use. And if it's high, it may be pushing minerals that are causing, because they're toxic, oxidative stress in the body into the tissues and then causing other problems. So blood always wants to be in homeostasis. So mineral balance through hair and identifying mineral levels through hair is going to give us a deeper level of knowledge than what blood can bring to the table. So what do minerals do? Minerals are essential for numerous functions in the body, of course. HTMA is a priceless blueprint to guide what nutrition and supplementation a horse needs based on, like I mentioned earlier, their own bio individuality and, of course, the patterns, the distinct patterns that we're seeing on the hair test. Mineral balancing supports the building of the foundation of the horse's health to ensure that imbalances may be addressed prior to them causing any major health challenges. So HTMA is a really proactive approach, not only for yourself, but for your animals, to be able to see things at a deeper level before they're picked up, like I mentioned, potentially in blood work, be able to correct some of those imbalances so that down the road, those major health challenges might be able to be avoided. So I want to talk about some key minerals. So these are important. And we're going to look at, obviously, an EHAA test result. And so we're going to talk about 4 macro minerals. So you can see at the top chart here, there's actually 6 macro minerals. So we have sulfur, calcium, phosphorus, sodium, potassium, and magnesium. So those are our 6 macro minerals. We're going to focus on 4. And so the first one we're going to talk about is calcium. So what does calcium actually do in the body? So about 99% of the calcium in the body is found in the bones and the teeth, with calcium constituting about 35% of equine bone. Plays an essential role in a variety of metabolic processes, which can be altered by small changes in extracellular concentrations. Calcium can slow nerve impulse transmission needed for secretion of certain neurotransmitters. So it can slow down the body to a certain extent. When elevated, it can increase in the secretions of saliva, tears, nasal drainage, sweating, and urine in a horse. When depleted, so on the other hand, can increase cell permeability and exhibit in the horse as anxiety, irritability, nervousness, hyperactivity, muscle cramps and spasms, tooth decay, alkaline urine, insomnia, and bruising. So again, calcium really does support the proper permeability of cells. And when that permeability, when that calcium is too elevated, or when that calcium is too low, that affects cell permeability. And of course, symptoms come along with that. So back to the test again. So we talked about calcium. Now I want to talk about sodium, one of our main electrolytes. So sodium here in this position is elevated. So let's see what that means as well. So sodium is critical for the maintenance of blood pressure and increases heart rate. It's vital for normal function of the central nervous system and transport of many substances such as glucose across cell membranes. Sodium is the extracellular cation and the electrolyte involved in the maintenance of acid-base balance and osmotic regulation of the bodily fluids. Elevated hair sodium, so right, like one we're looking at is elevated, is indicative of stress, which can bring about inflammation, excessive adrenal gland activity, excitability, and nervousness in a horse. It's required to produce hydrochloric acid in the stomach, and it's the first mineral to elevate to support the body's stress response. And we're going to talk all about the stress response today and how amazing the hair test is to bring to light the stress that an animal may be experiencing. So back to our chart, another macro mineral that's really important is potassium. Now this one's in the normal range. You can see it's been identified there in green. And so let's talk a little bit about potassium and what it does. So as the major intracellular cation, potassium is involved in the maintenance of acid-base balance and osmotic pressure, and is the most quantitatively important ion involved in neuromuscular excitability. The total amount of body potassium in a 500-kilo horse has been estimated to be about 28,000 milliequivalents. An extremely important mineral for both electrical and cellular functioning. Fatigue is the most common result of chronic potassium deficiency. Early signs include muscle weakness, slow reflexes, and very dry skin. These are initial problems, and if the deficiency continues to exist, it may progress to nervous disorders, insomnia, slow or irregular heartbeat, and it may also impair glucose metabolism and lead to elevated blood sugar. So potassium is really important. In more severe cases of deficiency, it actually may show as decreased heart rate, central nervous system changes, severe muscle weakness, bone fragility, and even death. So potassium is just as important in animals as it is in people. So, and the last of the four I call them the big four minerals because they have a huge impact on overall health, is magnesium. And you can see here, this magnesium is quite low, right? The normal value, the bottom end of the range, starting at 489, and we're at 211. And so what is magnesium important for? Magnesium constitutes approximately 0.05% of the body mass, supports the cardiovascular system, normal heart rate and blood pressure. It's needed for hundreds of enzymatic processes. Some people say 300, others say 600, and now there's new data that actually say it could be up to 800. Excuse me. And it's required for the conversion of glucose to glucose 6-phosphate, which is the first step to carbohydrate metabolism. Magnesium tends to be low if calcium is low. A deficiency can exhibit in a horse as poor appetite, irritability, weakness, twitching, numbness, tingling, personality changes, and confusion. Magnesium deficiency may also be the driver behind aggressive behavior, elevated cholesterol, and apathy. So again, lots of symptoms for all of these big four minerals, these four macro minerals that we've talked about, that can be exhibited by a horse if they are out of balance. So let's move on now. I want to talk about some key mineral relationships. And so these mineral relationships really start with the mineral wheel. And if any of you are familiar with the mineral wheel, I don't have a diagram here, but basically minerals, there are many different interrelationships when we're talking about minerals. And so those interrelationships, when analyzing a test, are critically important for us to be able to assess. And so ratios tell us a lot about the body too. There are a number of ratios that tell us about the functionality of the body, and we're going to talk about those now. So remember how I talked about stress earlier, and that we get into that. So sodium to potassium, that's identified as the vitality, or another name for that is called the stress ratio. And so in my opinion, this is one of the most important pieces of information shown on the HTMA, because it assesses the type and degree of stress that a horse's body is managing at any given point in time. So the higher that ratio is, the more acute the stage of stress is. And the lower the ratio is, the more chronic and exhaustive that stage of stress is. And so let's talk a little bit more about the stages. So Dr. Hans Selye, some of you may or may not heard of him. He actually discovered the stress theory. So he's the founder of the stress theory, and he identified stages of stress. So the word stress is used in physics to refer to the interaction between a force and the resistance to counter that force. And it was Hans Selye who first incorporated this term into the medical lexicon to describe non-specific response of the body to any demand. That's how he described stress. He then distinguished acute stress from the total response to chronically applied stressors, right? So the acute response versus the chronic response. Terming the latter condition of chronic general adaptation syndrome, so GAS. The syndrome divides the total response from stress into three distinct phases, and these relate to our sodium to potassium ratio. The first stage being the acute or alarm stage of stress, the second being the resistance or adaptation stage, and then the third being the exhaustion stage. So let's go through each one of those in a little more detail. So the acute or alarm stage of stress, this is an early stage of stress where the sodium rises quickly to support the stress response, right? To support the adrenals. In many cases, the animals is in sympathetic dominance. So that's that fight or flight, right? If a bear is chasing us, we want our adrenals to fire up so that we can run away. That is sympathetic dominance. And couple this with something called fast oxidation. And so we're going to talk about fast oxidation next, but just remember that it results in a low calcium to phosphorus level. That's another significant ratio to look at. So here's a perfect example of early stage acute or alarm stage of stress that I pulled from a graph. You can see the sodium to potassium is at 0.66 and the upper range ends at 0.4. So this particular horse is in the acute stage of stress. So when we have that acute or alarm stage and a high sodium to potassium, what happens? Inflammation and symptoms associated potentially with zinc and magnesium deficiency. Inflammation can take the form of arthritis, colitis, tendinitis. This pattern can cause aches and pains as well as obesity. Toxic metals have also a tendency to rise sodium levels, and this could result in a high sodium to potassium ratio. So if we have metals in the environment that are building in the horse, then we could have a high sodium to potassium because of that stress that the toxic metal is causing in the body. So then we move into the resistance or adaptation stage. So this occurs when the body's attempting to adapt to the continued stress, but it can no longer maintain the same response as it had in the alarm stage, right? So we can run from that bear, and in the beginning we might be sprinting, but if we keep sprinting, eventually we're going to slow down. That's where we are here. This adaptive stage can go on for quite some time, right? Every horse is different. In some cases, years, in some cases, days, right? And this can show up in an animal in either parasympathetic, so that rest and digest phase. And again, we're going to talk about that in a minute, or that sympathetic state, that fight or flight where we're running from the bear. So a horse can be in either of those autonomic nervous system states to have this resistance or adaptation stage show up. Ultimately, what lies ahead, irregardless, I should say, of the autonomic nervous system response is less energy and potentially conditions, including many symptoms. And so here's a perfect example of a horse that's heading into the adaptation stage where the sodium to potassium is at 0.22 and the bottom end of the range is 0.21. So it's just barely hanging on within that reference range. So the exhaustion stage is more of an advanced stage of stress. That's where the body's energy reserves are being depleted or they're depleting, and the body's faltering from being able to deal with the ongoing stressor. In this stage, the sodium and potassium will potentially drop due to the chronic stress. The animal most likely by this point has slipped into parasympathetic dominance. So again, the body in sympathetic dominance wants to run from that bear, but when that running gets to be too much, eventually the body goes into rest and digest because it needs to recover. And if we stay there, then that's when parasympathetic dominance sets in, and that correlates with a high calcium to phosphorus level. And again, we're going to talk about that in a minute. So the exhaustion stage with that low sodium to potassium, this ratio actually is seen in herbivores a lot more often. And so what can it be associated with? Well, it can be associated with infections, chronic emotions, chronic stress resulting in fatigue, excessive tissue breakdown or catabolism, and blood sugar imbalance. So not some great symptoms. So here's the next key mineral relationships that we want to look at. And so we've talked about calcium to phosphorus a couple times in those stress. I want to bring that back around with regards to, again, how it relates to that stress response and what some of the common patterns are. So this particular ratio, we term it the oxidation ratio, or the ratio that tells us the autonomic state that the body is in. So again, a low ratio is in that fight or flight. We're running from that bear in sympathetic dominance. A high ratio, we're in rest and digest, right? We've had a big meal and all we want to do is sit down on the couch and let our body rest and digest. Your body's slowing down, it's trying to recover. So the horse has slipped into parasympathetic dominance if the ratio is higher. And so one of the other things that's really, really interesting with regards to HTMA analysis is the fact of what it tells us about the endocrine and performance evaluation. So this comes back around again as we're talking about the oxidation ratio, that calcium to phosphorus. And that's the relationships between some energy producing glands, those particularly being the adrenals and the thyroid. And so those energy producing glands have the capability to help the body produce energy efficiently and can identify the strength, speed, and endurance of the horse's body. Now, the pituitary has a little bit to do with this too. And so when we look at a low ratio, so if we have, again, sympathetic dominance running from the bear, a low calcium to phosphorus, that comes back around to anterior pituitary dominance. Now, if that ratio is high, so we're in the rest and digest phase, parasympathetic dominance, and our CA to P is elevated, that's going to signify posterior pituitary dominance, which is going to be reflective of that parasympathetic dominance. And calcium will signify basically that high calcium is going to slow the body down, and it's going to cause a reduction in metabolic activity. So we really want to have a nice balance in the autonomic nervous system. We don't want someone to be too far in fight or flight where they're burning themselves out and eventually will slip down into rest and digest. We want to have a nice balance. We want to have stress resiliency. And so here's a perfect example of sympathetic dominance. We've been talking about this for a few slides now. So in this particular case, the calcium to phosphorus is low. So we see the normal value somewhere between 3.99 to 4.87. This patient's results are at 2.65. So this horse's autonomic nervous system is in fight or flight, which means there's a heightened reaction to stress, and chances are the Na to K, the sodium to potassium ratio that we talked about, that stress ratio in this particular case, most likely is elevated, and they're in the acute or alarm stage of stress. Now, remember, stress can become chronic. So what happens when that happens? Well, then we end up somewhere here. This is parasympathetic dominance. So the horse's autonomic nervous system is resting and digesting. The body is slowing down. And so in many cases, again, this may correlate with chronic stress or a chronic stressor. But what's happening is the horse's body is faltering at keeping up with that alarm or acute stress response. And now they're starting to slow down. And so this can be seen sometimes, again, along with a low sodium to potassium ratio, where we're in that exhaustive stage of stress. So some more key mineral relationships, and this is going to keep us going with that endocrine performance evaluation. And these, again, we're talking about a couple of energy producing glands here, thyroid and adrenals. And so calcium to potassium represents the horse's thyroid function. A high ratio tells us that the sluggish might be a bit, or the thyroid might be a bit sluggish, and a low ratio might be a bit overactive. Sodium to magnesium represents adrenal function. And so a high ratio can say, well, maybe we have a bit of overactivity in the adrenals, and a low ratio, potentially sluggish adrenals. And so why are we concerned about performance evaluation with regards to the thyroid and the adrenals? Well, this is a really interesting fact. So the calcium to potassium ratio is actually reflective of thyroid function, which we already know, but that relates to endurance. So if the thyroid function is strong, then this would indicate adequate energy production for long distances or for extended periods of time. So think about, 100-mile horses, right? They need strong thyroid function. They need that endurance. Flip the coin, and if the thyroid's a bit sluggish, then long distance endurance will be negatively impacted. So that's a really important factor, especially for performance horses. Now let's look at the adrenals, because this is a different side of the coin. So the Na to Mg that we talked about, sodium to magnesium, represents adrenal activity, but that provides a measurement for speed. So how hot can they be off the starting line? It's directly correlated with adrenal function, and the adrenals are responsible for that fast energy production. So if they're sluggish, then speed and quickness is going to be affected. It's going to be negatively affected. On the other hand, if the adrenals are operating well, then speed will be heightened. So again, very important things to consider and evaluate if you have performance horses. And then the last kind of 3 key mineral interrelationships ratios that we look at are zinc to copper, which tells us about the horse's hormone balance, calcium to magnesium, which tells us about blood sugar balance, and then iron to copper. And iron to copper is an interesting one because this one tells us a little bit about the body and the potential of infections. And so a high ratio could be reflective, not always, but could be reflective of a bacterial infection, and a low ratio a viral infection. So 7 interrelationships of minerals, it represented in ratios, telling a lot about what's happening in a horse's body. Toxic metals. So the Environmental Protection Agency states that hair is one of the main tissues of choice to determine toxic metal status in the body. And again, non-invasive, easy sample to collect, and tells us so much. The presence of toxic metals, as we mentioned earlier, is not only going to increase stress, but it could cause chronic stress, inflammation, and now it's also going to start to affect the body's stress load and how the body has stress resiliency, right? So if the horse ends up with toxic metals, they're going to end up slipping into that chronic exhaustive stage of stress. And that's not a great place for them to be. So how do they get them, right? Everybody says, how did my horse get to be toxic, right? Where are these metals coming from? It's pretty, there's lots of different sources. We're sitting here breathing air where we are right now today, and we're breathing in toxins, right? Our environment is full of toxins. We have to admit that. We know this. And so we need to be able to support ourselves and our body to be able to handle those with success. So some of the main sources of toxic metals is going to be food, right? Water, air pollution, other ingested substances, and potentially absorption through the skin. So think about pesticides, right? If we're on farms and there's farming and we're using herbicides and pesticides, that could be inhaled, could also be absorbed through the skin to a certain extent. So what's the number one toxic metal in horses? Aluminum, hands down. Aluminum is actually the 3rd most prevalent element and the most abundant metal on the Earth's surface. It appears to accumulate most in brain cells. Excessive aluminum is associated with intestinal colic and another nerve reduction symptom, of course. Aluminum affects calcium metabolism, bone mineral reserves, and will further be a causal factor in mineral imbalances. So remember that stress in the body causes a cascade throughout the macromineral system. And so as soon as we have toxic metals on board, and I will tell you, almost every horse I've tested has high aluminum. And so that's going to affect elements like magnesium and potentially zinc, maybe even potassium. And it's going to put that horse into a chronic exhaustive stage of stress. And now we're going to have symptoms that go along with that. So aluminum exposure can occur from airborne sources, maybe exposed based on food processing techniques. That's another one. Certain types of rains on soil may increase the uptake of aluminum into pastures. And then support, what do we do? Well, strategies for removing excess aluminum start with balancing the metabolic rate, right? If we have a horse that's tired and lethargic, we want to be able to increase the functionality of that horse, support the adrenals and support the thyroid to be able to have a healthy metabolic state. Mineral support, right? For what's warranted based on the testing. So we might need calcium. We might need magnesium, maybe advantageous with regards to supplementation. Alongside mineral balance, you can use a binder. One of the ones that we found in our team to be one of the most effective for heavy metals is zeolite. And support with removal of aluminum under the practitioner supervision of veterinarians, of course, and recommendations. So here's a perfect example of a test result with a really high aluminum. So again, number one toxic metal. And you can see the maximum value here is 382 and the patient's result is 455. And so really elevated. I mean, there's other elevations here too, but we're just discussing aluminum today. And so I want to talk about the power of mineral balance. And so we've talked about, to give kind of a recap, because I know there's a lot of information there. So again, one of the most important things that mineral balance brings to the table is the stress of the horse, right? The horse's body, the stress that they're under. How is it? Is it an acute stressor that maybe they got exposed to something, or maybe their food, maybe their hay was not great. Maybe there was a little bit of mycotoxins in there, something like that. That's something acute, right? Causes that acute stress in the body. Could also be something external. Maybe they're in a pen with another horse that they don't like or that stresses them, right? I had one horse in particular that was being bullied in a pen and they wouldn't let him drink any water. So that was super stressful for him. So until that was resolved and he was moved to another area, he was stressed, and that was an acute stressor. So once we moved him, then of course the stress came down. So that's, again, a perfect example of acute stress. But when we have metals on board, when we have things that are becoming chronic, even that situation could become chronic, right? If there's nowhere else for them to go, then that's something that comes up. And now that horse, again, the body starts to slow down, metabolism starts to slow down. And as soon as that happens and they move into that exhaustive stage of stress, they're not going to be able to respond to stressors the same as they used to. And that is a really important takeaway from this particular test, because it can tell you so much about what might be going on in the horse. And the other interesting part is too, a lot of people don't think about internal stress. So, right, we're talking about toxic metals. Most times when horses are tested, the owners are like, oh my goodness, where are these things coming from? I had no idea. They had no idea, right? We don't know what's going on inside the horse's body per se. And so when those things are brought to light, that's when you really start to understand that there's more under the surface that's causing some of these symptoms that might be starting to come out. So there's usually a root cause for those. And so I want to talk about a little bit about an equine review. And I thought this would be interesting. And so this particular horse was in one of our trials, and this is kind of a feedback and walkthrough of a journey for her health over the course of a 90-day period. She's actually still one of our clients. She's just over a year of minimal balancing now, but this is the very beginning, and it's very powerful share. So this is Sammy. So Sammy's 13. She's a quarter horse. Sammy came to us with 4 specific issues. So the first one being she had consistent or chronic painful ulcers that no matter what they tried, they just couldn't get rid of. She had weight fluctuations, so weight loss and then weight gain, very hard to keep muscle on. It was really a really tough challenge in this particular case. She had lethargy and really an absolute inability to work under saddle. So she just had no energy. She really had no energy, and she was agitated at the same time. And she had a complete lack of interest to eat. It was a stretch for her owner to be able to get her to consume her meal in the evening. And so that was a bit concerning, considering the fact that, of course, we're worried about weight, and the fact that she wouldn't eat was a problem. So, we had to kind of look at a few things here, but what we wanted to do first off was see what was going on in the body that we could identify through her hair. And so I went to the barn. Obviously, I do my assessment. And so she wasn't interested in being touched. She was very sensitive. Her anxiousness was evident. She was standing in the barn, but she was unsteady, and she wouldn't stand still. She had very nervous energy. She even had loose stool when she was in the barn, right? And I mean, that happens sometimes, but she was definitely agitated and shifting and moving constantly. It was even really hard for me to take the hair sample because she didn't even want me to touch her mane to take the hair sample. So her behavior was really unsettled. She was just very, very agitated. So what had they tried before? Well, they tried omeprazole, right, for ulcers. They tried switching her feed. So, they brought in bee pulp, they took out bee pulp, they brought in alfalfa, they took out alfalfa. They were trying all kinds of different things just to see if she would eat anything. They tried chiropractic, which they continued with, osteopathic treatments, generic vitamin and mineral support. They had her on that for quite some time as well. Some different probiotics, because they thought maybe that would help, obviously, with the GI. And then some natural ulcer supplements to back up the omeprazole. And so what would happen basically, and I feel this happens quite a lot, is that you may see some relief initially, but then it's not sustainable, or it ends up coming back. And sometimes the ulcers come back even worse than they did in the previous time. So they just weren't getting the results that they wanted, and they weren't getting sustained results. So that was obviously a problem. And so the initial review. So first off, okay, so we have lethargy, right? We have lethargy. we have elevated tissue calcium. And so that's slowing the metabolism. So Sammy didn't have any energy because her metabolism was slowing down. And then her magnesium was elevated, right? So we knew there was a bit of an elevation there, but potentially a little bit of a loss too, because magnesium is mainly an intracellular mineral. And so, and because of what we'll talk about in a minute with her ratios, that was something where sometimes horses need a little magnesium, but again, it has to be in the right balance with the other macro minerals, especially when you're talking about calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium. So she definitely had a low sodium, so there was a deficiency there. And the interesting part too is I have a lot of horses where they're sodium deficient and they really don't have the innate craving to go to their salt block or their free choice salt. But once they start mineral balancing, they end up there more often, which I find really interesting. It's almost like they don't know what they're missing until they get a little bit of it, and they're like, "Oh, wait a minute! I actually feel better when I'm taking in salt." So I find that that's a huge change, and then they end up drinking more water because of that too. Potassium was in a deficient state. Zinc was in a deficient state. So when you really look at her state, going back to what we talked about earlier, the calcium to phosphorus here was high. So again, the body was slowing down, was in that parasympathetic rest and digest phase, right? And the other part of this is that with the sodium being low, the potassium being low, now we had a low sodium to potassium level. So she was in an exhaustive stage of stress. So her ulcers and the other kind of imbalances in the body were causing this chronic stress, and her body just wasn't able to be resilient to it anymore. Zinc deficiency is another one, and zinc deficiency is common in most animals, actually. And then, of course, we had aluminum toxicity. Right, really high aluminum. And due to aluminum toxicity, one of the vet that I work with, one of the kind of mechanisms that are thought about with regards to that relationship is that a protective mechanism that the body has is to elevate iron when aluminum is elevated. And so she had a little bit of elevated iron too in response to that aluminum. So the aluminum was kind of the biggest thing I was concerned about. But one of the ways that I look at mineral balance and that common word of detox is that we have to support the body with the nutrients that it's missing, right? We have to support it with the potentially a small amount of magnesium, our sodium, the potassium, the zinc, the other things that we're seeing that the horse's body needs. Because if those things aren't on board to produce more energy, to make sure that the thyroid and the adrenals are functioning optimally, or at least close to optimal, then what'll happen, the functionality increases and the body naturally wants to let toxicity go. So that's one of the main things to start with when we have toxic metals on board, because we want the body to allow the release of that aluminum to be strong enough to be able to detox it. And so then once that starts happening, you can use other things to mop up some of those toxic metals and to be able to help the process. And so her ratios, the ones that really stood out, I have here. So let's start with the stress ratio, because again, that's one of the most important takeaways from the test. And so she was in a low NA to K. So her stress ratio was low. So she was in the exhaustion stage of stress. Her calcium to potassium, her thyroid ratio was slightly elevated. So that tells me that she had a sluggish thyroid. Her sodium to magnesium, her adrenal function was low. So sluggish adrenals too. So now we've got an exhaustive stage of stress. We've got a horse with underactive thyroid happening, or sluggish thyroid activity, sluggish adrenal activity. She's not going to be responding well to any stressor. And then her iron to copper was really high. And so that could mean that we have bacteria on board. Okay. So just again, more identifiers for us to kind of dig into to say, okay, how do we do this? What do we start with? And is there any additional testing that somebody might want to do? And so here's what we did. So first off, whenever we look at protocols, we always look at dietary, right? Do we need to change the diet? We're in a country that has winter. So obviously in the winter, we've got vitamin A challenges, because rather than eating pasture grass, now the horses are eating hay, right? So the vitamin A goes down. So dietary changes, we picked a lot of our dietary changes based on the ulcer symptoms that that Sammy was experiencing. And so some of those changes, we added in some ground flax, we added in some chia seeds for omega-3s. And so we kind of just added to her diet to see if we could be able to calm down some of the GI symptoms so that she could actually have an interest in eating. We used a probiotic, right, for her digestive and her GI support. That was really important as well. And then we used a natural ulcer support. So that had some amino acids as well as some Norwegian kelp. And the kelp was great because it brought iodine into the picture in a natural form to be able to support the thyroid. And then we chose a multi-mineral and vitamin supplement that was customized for her based on her results. And then we, of course, used a toxin binder. And so zeolite, in this particular case, worked really well. It was taken away from meals and away from other minerals and vitamins because we didn't want it to bind to those. But it did do a great job at binding to the aluminum. And so let's look at the 90-day journey. As we go through here, we had some great feedback that I just wanted to share from her owner. And so her owner's name is Paige. And so after 30 days, she said that Sammy had a drastic mood change. She was a lot less moody. So that was nice for us to hear. I thought, okay, that's good. Her interest in being groomed and touched had increased. So she didn't seem to be as inflamed anymore, which was good. Said she's a very big fan of hay, but is still continuously dunking it. So we knew that there was obviously still some uncomfortableness there when she was dunking her hay constantly. And then a sensitivity to the flank area. Second week on both sides, it was getting a little bit better, but just marginally. So a couple of things had changed in the first 30 days, which was at least nice to know that things were starting to move in the right direction. 60 days, another follow-up, same questions. And so she said, Sammy's stomach is doing much better. She's not dunking her hay as much. Okay, that's getting better gradually, so that's great. Gained a little weight and is maintaining it. That was excellent news because it had been a long time before Sammy could keep weight on. Overall, had a better mood, increased willingness to work, and not showing as many signs of ulcer symptoms. And her desire to eat feed had increased by that point, and her stool had been significantly more solid. And that was really great for us to know, just because, again, she had loose stool for so long. And I think the probiotic really did help to normalize that. And I think, again, because the body was getting more of the nutrients that it was kind of really lacking, that she was getting a bit more balanced from the state. And so then our last feedback was at 90 days. And so positive changes at this point, she had improved gut health, increased immune function, steady weight gain, and maintaining that weight, which is great. And her diarrhea issues had been alleviated. So that was excellent news for us. At the beginning of the protocol, she was extremely uncomfortable, obviously, with ulcers, which I mentioned. And once she had finished 90 days, the chiropractor had done her pressure point assessment, and there was actually no signs of ulcers. So that was excellent. And again, this progress is exceptional, right? We don't see this with every horse, but with Sammy, she just had such great results, and it happened very quickly. So Paige said, I don't think there's anything that hasn't improved since she started on the protocol. Her mood's changed. She's significantly more willing to be touched and near people. She was a lot more social. Her energy level increased. She was more willing to work both in the ring, under saddle, and on the lunge line. And she finally has the ability to gain muscle and start to grow a top line. So that was great to hear. Immune system has improved. She used to get bumps all over her face and from bug bites, and she actually didn't get any after her treatment. So she's had an increase in appetite, a new interest in grains as well. Plus she has increased her water intake. And again, back to the free choice salt, she seemed to have a lot more of an attraction to consuming more salt once she had gone through the protocol. And so just the end here, both her coat and hooves had improved significantly. At the beginning of the protocol, she was consistently having diarrhea, and of course her stool's back to normal. And so, Paige just said at the beginning of this protocol, I was hoping that just one of her issues would be solved. I didn't expect for all of them to be solved. And again, so this is an exceptional result, but I just wanted to share. And I also wanted to share the photos just so you can see the before and after, because it really does bring forth, what proper mineral balance can look like, and what can be achieved. And so here's Sammy's follow-up picture. And I know it's hard to tell the difference, so I have some side-by-sides that are going to come up next, but I want to just talk about my follow-up assessment. And so when I went to see Sammy at the barn to take her hair sample and visit her to see how she was doing, it was like it was a different horse. She had a calm demeanor. She was extremely relaxed. I was brushing her coat, and her coat completely changed. Her mane completely changed. And what I mean by her coat completely changed was one of the things that really, for me, in the past 3 years of kind of starting down the animal path of HTMA and testing hundreds and hundreds of horses, when you touch a horse that is deficient in minerals or vitamins, right, just micronutrients, I find that their coat is very rough. And so when you touch them and that coat is rough, it almost, in my head, it's like, it mimics kind of like brushing straw, right? It's kind of, it's just rough and prickly. And I will say, after 90 days, when you go back and the first thing I do is touch them. And when you touch them, it's like their coat is like velvet, right? Their hair is just smooth and silky and soft, and they have a nice sheen to them. And it's amazing to see that. And it's one of the first changes that I notice in every horse. But yeah, for her, I mean, she's standing still in one place. She had no issues, taking a retest sample, being, kind of, I was rubbing her the whole time I was talking to Paige as we were talking about changes and protocols and what have you. And she was super calm, and she was almost falling asleep. So going from that anxious energy to that, just can't stand still, to this, it was two totally different scenarios. And so here are the before and after. So I have a couple of before and after. We'll scroll through them, but I mean, one on the left obviously is before. You can see she's quite thin. Her coat is very dull. Her mane is dull. She just looks so thin. And you can see she's gained muscle in her shoulder, in her hind quarter. Her top line's growing. She's gained weight. You can see that nice sheen on her coat. Her mane changed as well. It was a lot smoother. Her tail was growing. It was just literally like night and day. And so this is a different side view. Again, you can see just the changes in her coat and her weight. And then even again in her hind quarter, more defined hind quarter, more defined chest, and just generally overall maintaining a good weight and some good musculature there. And so in closing, what causes mineral imbalances? Stress. Right? Sometimes we don't see the stress. That's why it's so important for that sodium to potassium ratio to communicate with us as horse owners, or even as us, right? We may not even recognize it in ourselves. That sodium to potassium ratio tells us a lot about the body. Improper nutrition, right? Even improper nutrition just for that horse, right? They're all bio-individual. Each one has a different makeup. And so one may thrive on a nutrition plan and another horse may not, right? Lack of exercise or over-exercise. Incompatible supplementation. Maybe we're supplementing with things that they don't really need. And this is the blueprint you need to be able to identify that. Toxic metals, right? Aluminum. Medications that they may be taking, or even infections that we may not even realize or know about. And so equine mineral balance, I mean, just like us, when minerals are out of balance, there's symptoms that are going to come up, right? Lethargy and all of these things, GI distress, ulcers, right? The most commonly noted for our team is fatigue, dry coat, ulcers, pain symptoms, chronic Lyme, cracking hooves, and laminitis. So those are the big ones. And, all we do is start by looking at the GI health. Right? Are we having diarrhea? Are we having normal stools? Do we need a probiotic on board? Adding in that targeted nutrition based on their hair test. And then looking at some nutrient support that's going to be able to support the minerals that they really need and be able to support the body's functionality, because that's the key to them obviously getting better. And so last kind of words here before I open the forum for some questions is, equine hair tissue mineral analysis really is the best way to keep our four-legged family members living a healthy life. All horses can benefit from mineral balance, not only to support performance, but also longevity. And so there's a list of references. I'm assuming that Marcin maybe sends out, or this is available to those who are watching and may watch the recording. And then, of course, how to be able to get a hold of me. So I want to open for some questions. And I see that we have some people in the chat. And so I'm not sure if I can share this or if you can all see it with regards to the questions. So Elizabeth said, seen all issues, problems discussed before, mare with hormonal issues requiring a regimate, horse with heaves, horse with sarcoids at 12 years old. Oh my goodness. Horse I put out of a kill pen who was so exhausted that when she figured out she was safe, we worried about her going down, and so many more. Oh, it's so sad. And I see it all the time, just about, and I have found too, this is a conversation that I had with one of the horse owners, with one of the horses, the horse that I mentioned that was getting bullied. He actually wasn't able, the other horses weren't allowing him to get to the water trough. So he was dehydrated, severely dehydrated actually. And, a lot of times we don't think about the stress that I want to say hierarchy of, maybe the barn or the horses in a certain pen, what that does to a horse and how much stress that actually causes. And that's a really relevant thing to think about, because, that is stressful. And we have to think about what that's doing to their mineral system, how many electrolytes they're going through. Their sodium has to respond to be able to make the adrenals respond to that stress. And then all of a sudden it becomes chronic and it's something that's going on daily, right? And that's, we just talked about how that cascades down with regards to the stress response, right? Going from that acute stage of stress where it's just going to start. And then really what's happening is the horse is trying to hang on. It's like, I'm going to hang on because I know I need to respond to this stress, but I can't do it at the same rate I did anymore. And now all of a sudden I'm exhausted, right? And then all of a sudden we have all these symptoms, right? Even when you come back around to chronic Lyme and things like that, like a lot of those symptoms that are associated with those different conditions, we've seen a reduction in some of them just by supporting the main minerals, the vital minerals. And again, as the body gets stronger, those vital minerals are, they're definitely going to affect the rest of the body. And if we can support those vital minerals, if there are metals on board or other stressors on board or imbalances on board, that's only going to help the body get stronger. Remember how important it is for the sodium to magnesium to support the adrenals and the balance of calcium to potassium to support thyroid function. And our endocrine system is going to respond to all of that, and it's what creates our energy. So that's really important. From Facebook, what could be the reasons for high levels of aluminum? Oh, that goes back to our slide. Yeah. I mean, food processing, airborne. I mean, there's so many different contributors to toxic metal buildup, right? So when we look back here with regards to, let me just pull this up here. Yeah. Food, water, air pollution, absorption through the skin, aluminum specifically. Airborne sources is a big one. They may be exposed based on food processing techniques. The other thing, and I mean, it's only a theory. So you have to take this with a grain of salt. But one of the things too is that, if there are foods where, or feeds that are being made, and there's always a question of mycotoxins, right? So for those of you who don't know, mycotoxins obviously come from mold. And, hopefully every, barn and every farm owner or ranch owner are testing for mold, right? Moisture content in hay, because that's obviously the effect. But in feeds, if they're using things like zeolites, and they're using zeolites maybe that aren't as pure and I would say USP grade, because that's the highest grade to be ingested. If they're not the highest grade, then that can contribute to some of that buildup, because ultimately zeolite is aluminum silicate, right? So that's, yeah, so that's definitely something to consider. So there's lots of different areas that they can get exposed to. And I find as well, again, the stronger the mineral levels are, the more balanced the mineral levels are, the more optimal they are, the less chance that they have to build those metals, because the body's strong enough to deal with them. Ideally, what we want is our bodies to be strong enough, our horses' bodies to be strong enough, so that if we are breathing in toxins or being exposed to metals or what have you, that we're able to just detox them as they come in. It's like they come in, they go out, they come in, they go out, right? But as they come in, if they're coming in huge amounts, or if they're coming in and there's other things that's going on in the body, like chronic ulcers and all these other things, that now the body has such a huge workload of stress that something's got to give, right? And so chances are the priority of that, maybe those metals are starting to build because they're a little bit lower on the priority list. Yeah. Okay, so seeing those sore coats fixed with mineral supplements, it made me look into nutrition more and more. He also had a poor coat that was uneven and not soft, and it took almost 2 years to get him really fixed with hooves growing normally, soft coat, and sarcoids laser off, and have not returned ever. And I'm now much more picky about my horse's feet. Yeah, you have to be. And that's all. Like, I'm so happy that you figured that out, because, sometimes we just don't know. Right. And it's the same with dogs and cats. And I mean, even ourselves, processed foods on the shelf are like, even health food stores that have processed food, but then it's really high in certain things and it's got other additives. And, we have to be really careful, and we have to do our due diligence and read our labels, because again, all of these things affect mineral balance. And, when I talk about and do presentations for humans, for example, one of the things that comes up every single time we talk about what affects mineral levels, it's lifestyle factors. Lifestyle factors for a horse are water, feed, pasture, air, right? What does all that look like? Because any of those things that have toxins or certain exposures, the more that the horse is going to be exposed to that, the more that you potentially have that can be coming up and causing them problems. What do you think about Bowen therapy as a method of detoxification, especially in horses? I think there's lots of different therapies out there that can be utilized, right? I know that I have a lot of chiros, animal chiros actually, that use infrared red lighting and infrared blankets, and they find that those work really well. So I think there's lots of different methods. I think, though, one of the things that I said earlier is that when we're looking at minerals, we're looking at the foundation of the horse's health. And so one of the things I always say with regards to just in general is, we all have a foundation of health, and think of it like a basement of a home. Okay. Whether it's a human, whether it's a quadruped, it doesn't matter. You have that foundation. And if your foundation of your brick and your mortar and everything else, if that foundation has cracks and holes and is leaning to one side, then the rest of your house isn't going to be strong. So you have to start at the bottom, fill the holes and the gaps and the cracks in that foundation, which is your minerals, okay? And then everything else can help that. It's the same with things like peptides, right? I am a huge, huge lover of peptides, whether injectable or oral. But I know, and a lot of the peptide experts I work with know, that minerals have to go hand in hand with peptides, because minerals are filling the cracks and the gaps in that foundation so that the foundation can be strong, and then everything else just works a little bit better. I think we have another question coming in, so I'll give it a minute. These are some great questions, by the way. And Elizabeth, so amazing that you, just with minerals and nutrition, obviously you have so many things that you've worked with. That is amazing. So great job figuring all that out, because you really put in the time. And the fact that it's been 10 years, I think is amazing. So you should be super proud of the work that you've done. Okay, do you have an opinion about many feeds grains being made with so much molasses, corn syrups? Yeah. I've seen them given to horses, unable to put weight on, and regularly be ineffective despite more and more pounds of feed. I've seen sensitive breeds also get major anxiety from some sugar feeds as well. I heard you speak mostly about individual grains like flax and chia. Yeah, I try to stay away from some of the laminitis. I mean, we have to navigate the sugar in the horse's diet, right? And so think about us, right? It was standard American diet. We've got sugar, and then we've got all these symptoms that come along with that. Because what does it cause? It causes inflammation, right? So why would it be any different in our horses? So, first off, the one thing that I always look at, especially when you have a horse that can't gain weight, A, do they have the micronutrients they need? B, are they eating their feed? Are they getting enough feed? I mean, that's pretty basic. The other thing is too, though, is what does their amino acid status look like? Because those are the building blocks of muscle, right? And so one of the things that I see quite often in horses is they have low phosphorus. And low phosphorus means they have poor protein assimilation, which means most likely their body is screaming for amino acids. And so in a lot of cases, and again, I don't suggest that you run out and do this unless you're working with someone who makes a proper suggestion based on your horse's, right, hair test. But I mean, we use a lot of ground flax, stabilized ground flax. We use a lot of chia seeds for omega-3 and for protein. I use hemp protein quite often. You can use human hemp protein with horses to be able to increase amino acids and be able to increase protein uptake. Because again, a lot of them have low phosphorus, which come back around to a higher need for protein. You can even use other types of amino acid supplements. So I don't really go down the road of a lot of high sugar stuff. I try and stay away from that as much as possible. I mean, and again, depending on what the horse is doing, right? If you have horses who are competing and things like that, I mean, they're going to need a little bit of that. And we use beet pulp sometimes too, and things like that as well. But I do go down the road of using some different supports for protein and for amino acids based on that premise. And usually with kind of going from that perspective, maybe even bringing some alfalfa cubes into the picture, things like that. And then bringing in obviously the hay or the grass or whatever else they're feeding on for their main time, right? Whether it's a slow feeder or whether it's summer and they're out grazing, then usually they can start to put weight on. Again, there are extenuating circumstances where maybe there's something else going on in the horse that needs to be identified, and that's not going to happen. But in very general cases, that's usually, kind of an expected outcome, I guess. But again, I can't stress enough how important it is to look at the hair, because it's going to tell you exactly what the horse needs, and it's going to allow you to be able to streamline some of their nutrition and then be able to make sure that whatever supplementation you're using is going to be adequate for them and enough, because some horses need a lot more minerals and that than another, depending on what's going on in their body. And I think we're out of time. I think we've run overtime, Marcin. I'm sorry.
Lisa, thank you very much. It was so informative, valuable webinar for all of us. Great knowledge, a lot of information. So thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate it, and I hope we'll do it again in near future, because I believe that there are a lot of more questions we need to answer and ask also. So thank you very much for today's webinar, for being with us, and for all of you, thank you very much to being with Pets Diag, and of course feel invite for our next webinars soon.
Excellent.
Thank you very much. Stay healthy and see you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.